Welcome back to the Lessons from the Cockpit Show. I am your host, Mark Hasera, and I realize I've been gone for a couple weeks. I got that new flu, whatever it was, and it put me on my tail end. For over 60 years, my passion has been airplanes and aviation. And for over 24 years, I was a KC-135 pilot in the United States Air Force. Ask any pilot, what is the real definition of flying? And they're going to tell you, long periods of boredom interrupted by short, intermittent periods of extreme terror. And sometimes it's really extreme, and we're going to talk about that today. On the Lessons from the Cockpit Show, we debrief the most fascinating and intriguing pilots, aircrew members, maintainers, and aviation enthusiasts from all over the world. Our mission is to investigate the tactics, techniques, and procedures these aviators created and nurtured during those extreme and extraordinary flying operations. Our exploration is designed to give listeners practical advice and understanding on how does the aviation world work and expand critical thinking skills and expertise in the air and on the ground. On today's show, we're going to talk about reputation, trust, and relationships, and what these three attributes have to do with reducing risk. And the two stories I'm going to use to demonstrate this are a decade apart. Special thanks to the book Tanker Pilot, Lessons from the Cockpit, which is sponsoring this episode of the show. It can be found on Amazon in all four formats: hardback, softback, Kindle, and Audible. There are pictures in the book from the events we're going to talk about today. So, it is time to grab an adult beverage of your choice. Sit down, strap in, and let's begin the Lessons from the Cockpit Show. Monday, the 21st of January, my crew is coming in fairly early in the afternoon, and we hadn't been in the building 60 seconds when we came to the stairway, and D-Wright, the assistant chief of the planning cell, was looking down at us. And he says, "Sluggo, is your crew coming in to fly?" And I said, "Why, yes, D-Wright, we're coming in to fly." "Your mission is canceled." And it's very rare that this kind of thing happened, that your planned mission would be canceled like this. So coming up the stairs, I asked D-Wright, "What's going on?" And he said, "Your mission's canceled. Go to mission planning and wait for me there." Those were really odd instructions. And as I got to the top of the stairs, I asked him, I said, "What's happening?" And he said, 24 F-16s took off on a mission to go near downtown Baghdad and didn't get their pre-strike refueling. They couldn't arrange the schedule fast enough to give these guys front-side gas. The black hole has promised them they will get their backside gas, their post-strike gas, and you're part of that promise. Go to mission planning and wait for me there. And I told D-Rod, I said, "That's pretty ballsy." He goes, "I don't have time for this. I got to find one more crew." Walking into mission planning, Dan from Beale Air Force Base, California, Heidi from Wurtsmith Air Force Base in Michigan were waiting at a table. A few minutes later, Walrus from the Topeka Air National Guard met us and sat down at the table. So now there's 4 tanker crews sitting at the desk waiting for D-Wright to come talk to us. D-Wright comes to us with Sergeant Smith from Intel, and he says, "You guys have 50 minutes to go take off and meet these F-16s, or you will be involved in the largest rescue effort in Air Force history, because these guys will all be out of gas." There was a real sense of urgency in D-Wright's voice. You have 50 minutes to get this done and take off and meet these guys, or a lot of F-16 pilots are going to have to be rescued. Sergeant Smith launches into his intel brief. There's mobile anti-aircraft guns and surface-to-air missiles. We don't think they'll be underneath you, but they're roaming all around in the area that these guys are going to come back from. You're going to Lime Pre air refueling track, and you're going to have to go as far north as you dare go. And I thought to myself, what does he mean by that? As far north as we dare go. And he said to us, you will have to go into Iraqi airspace to pick these airplanes up. After his intel brief, D. Wright said, are there any questions? And of course, I'm thinking, yeah, there's a lot of questions. We're an unarmed airplane full of gas going into Iraqi airspace, but we didn't have time for it. Dan gave a really quick cell formation briefing so that we were all on the same page, and we went out the door about 10 minutes later. Dan has a map laid out in front of him, or a chart as a navigator calls them, and he begins the briefing. Tuna 4-5 flight. Looks like we're going to possibly go into Iraqi airspace so that we can save these F-16s that are going to be way low on gas. If something's firing at us, if you see it, call it out, let us know. We'll rely on AWACS to tell us of any other threats. Are there any questions? What could you say? We didn't have time to ask more questions. And we all went out the door, got on the bus. Arriving at our airplane, Kenny, Kevin, and Rick went straight upstairs and started working on the inside of the airplane. I was talking to the crew chiefs, telling them, this is what we're doing. And their eyes were big as silver dollars because they realized we're going into Iraqi airspace. We may not come home. There is a real sense of urgency for us to get in the air. We have to get in the air in 25 minutes. And normally it took us 45 minutes to do the pre-flight start engines, taxi, and take off. Doing a quick inspection of the airplane, I'm just looking for anything that's leaking or dripping or any panel that's open. That's all I've got time for. I get upstairs, strap in, we start the engines and start taxiing out to the end of the runway. Dan calls, Tuna 4-5 flight, check, 2, 3, 4. Jeddah Tower, Tuna 4-5 flight, taxi with urgency, we need to take off soon. Tower came back with, we know your mission, head to the runways, you'll have clearance when you get there. And Kevin tells me over the interphone, we're 4 minutes late already. 3 of us are flying in the old KC-135A models that actually use water injection for takeoff. The 4th guy, Walrus from Kansas, Guard, is flying an E model with fan jet engines, and he has to take off on another runway. So now we're trying to synchronize all of this as we get to the runways. But Dan was professional. All of us take off on the right timing, and we're all heading toward the east to Lime Pre air refueling track. And as we get airborne and are turning, I turn back at Kevin. He says, we're still 3 minutes late. Dan's navigator knew that. Had the power up. We were going faster. And finally, we get to the Lime Pre entry point, and we turn north and start heading up there. We're talking to the airborne warning and control airplane and a battle manager that is watching and taking care of our flight. Their call sign was Choctaw. And as we get to the end of Lime Pre, Dan asks, Choctaw, where's the beer? Every one of us in the cockpit knew what that question was. And Choctaw, the controller, comes back and says, Falstaff will be refueling with the F-16s, call signs Collie, Spaniel, and Pug. See, we were getting little bits of information while we're trying to fly this mission. Even though there's a sense of urgency, we didn't have all of the information, and we had just found out, okay, we're refueling Falstaff, Collie, Spaniel, and Pug. And at the end of the Lime Pre track in central Saudi Arabia, I see Dan's left wing raise up and head north. Kevin, my navigator, took a picture of our inertial navigation system when we crossed into Iraqi airspace. to kind of freeze it for posterity. As we're heading north, Choctaw begins talking to our receivers and sends them over to our refueling frequency. They are 90 miles in front of us. If the Iraqis start shooting at us, none of these airplanes have the gas to deal with the threat. You've got 4 fat tankers full of gas and all of these low fuel fighters that can't do anything. But we continue heading north. 21 miles from Dan's Nose to Kali, the mission commander's lead Viper, 21 miles, Kali lead calls out, Tuna 4-5 flight, turn south now. And Dan pushes his throttles up to air refueling speed for the fighters, and we go into a left-hand turn heading back toward the Saudi border. And it rains F-16s. I had my Minolta Maxim camera with me in my lap, and my co-pilot had his video camera with him on the dash. So we've got still pictures and video of this mission. And there are just F-16s coming down and just collapsing on us because they were at 47,000 feet in order to conserve gas. Collie flight goes to Dan's airplane. Spaniel flight goes to Heidi's airplane. Pug flight comes to us. Each one of these F-16 formations has 8 airplanes in them. 24 F-16s low on gas. Each one of the F-16 formations does a fuel check. In Pug flight, we find out there's one airplane, Pug 6, that has only 800 pounds of gas in the airplane. 800 pounds. And the pilot of that airplane says to my boom operator, Rick, Tuna 4-7, we've got one chance to do this, and then I'm going to have to go over the side. And Rick tells him, come straight to the boom. Come straight to the boom. Which he does. But he's coming from above us, so Rick can't see him through the window looking down. And after a few seconds, we hear Rick over the intercom go, oh my gosh, as they all show up. And he keeps telling the young pilot, come straight to the boom. He plugs in. The leader of Pug flight says, 4-7, give everybody 1,000 pounds and we'll cycle back through. In other words, give us some comfort gas so we can continue here, and then we'll cycle back through and get our go-home gas. And as they began cycling through, the radio goes dead quiet. There's still that sense of urgency in the air around us, but nobody's talking because everybody's doing what they're supposed to be doing. As they cycle through a second time, they get enough gas to go back to the United Arab Emirates, where they were all stationed at Al Minhad. Kali lead takes all of them up into the 30s, and he tells us, thank you for coming to get us. You guys did great work. But that was our job, to be on speed, on altitude, ready to refuel. That was our mission. That was our whole entire job. A decade later, in 2001, we have a similar situation. It's the opening night on the 7th of October of Operation Enduring Freedom. Carrier Air Wing 8 is on the USS Enterprise. They're doing all of the mission planning for the strikes that are going into Afghanistan on this opening night. My good friend Mongo was one of the lead strike planners in Carrier Air Wing 8. He was actually assigned to VFA 87, the war party. While talking to him on the phone, he told me, once again, Sluggo, gas was a big issue, and we had to fly long legs to get to some of our targets and drop our bombs. He said, you also have to remember, we didn't have a really good solid plan yet because we were still looking for targets at the same time, and F-14s are running around with a reconnaissance pod that takes all these pictures trying to gather target sets in order to do this. So we're planning on striking certain targets, and we're trying to find other targets, and we realize to go all the way across Afghanistan is a big gas issue. Afghanistan is a big, big country. We can't even talk on the radios across Afghanistan, our UHF radios, because our radios don't transmit that far, 275 miles. So there's a lot of issues that the Navy guys are having to work with. Gas, distance they have to fly, communications across this big, huge country. All of these things are what they're having to deal with while they're doing this plan for the first night, for the opening night of Operation Enduring Freedom over Afghanistan. Because of his experience, Mongo is tagged to go in on this first night and strike targets. His wingman is the newest lieutenant in the squadron. He has the most inexperienced pilot on his wing the opening night of a major air campaign over a foreign country. Mongo and his brand new wingman, the Navy uses the term nugget, launch off the USS Enterprise and head north. Everyone was refueling in western Pakistan and then going to their targets. This restriction meant that the Navy airplanes could not cover all of Afghanistan. They just couldn't go that far. They didn't have the gas because it's such a big country. Approaching the KC-135 he's supposed to refuel off of, he and his wingman, he sees 6 other airplanes waiting to get gas. The tanker planning factor is when we're carrying the drogue, which they plug into with a probe in the airplane, a lot like a hummingbird does at a hummingbird feeder. We can only transfer 1,000 pounds through that hose that's attached to the drogue, which is attached to our boom. And Mongo is flying an F-18 Hornet, as is his wingman. The most fuel inefficient airplane in the carrier wing. All of the fuel planning is based on the Hornets because they will run out of gas first. Each one of the Hornets coming to the tanker is probably getting around 9,000 pounds. That was kind of a typical low offload for the KC-135 into the Hornets, even in Iraq. Pulling up to this KC-135 with 6 airplanes already there, Mongo is doing tanker math in his head. And he realizes the 6 Hornets in front of him are going to take 50 to 54 minutes to get their 9,000 pounds. And that puts him off his timing. Mongo knows he won't make his time on target, his TOT. 54 minutes will put him behind. He won't be able to drop his bombs if he has to wait for these 6 airplanes to refuel. The tanker pilot tells Mongo and his wingman, hey, there's another tanker with no receivers on it right now orbiting over Herat, Afghanistan, to the north. This is one of the KC-135s of only a handful that actually have airspace that they use over Afghanistan. Most of the air refueling for the Navy packages is taking place in Pakistan, but there's this one lone tanker north in Herat, orbiting over Herat, 21,000 feet. And of course, Mongo has to figure out what's the risk. Doing some calculations in his head, he heads north with his inexperienced wingman on his wing. Mongo and his wingman have to fly 370 miles on the darkest night using night vision goggles because the tanker pilot said, hey, there's one up there. Go on up there. He and his wingman are flying over the most inhospitable area of Afghanistan, the desert area, which is down in the southwest of Afghanistan. He flies over the Dashta Imargo Desert, which in Pashtun means desert of death. And as they continue flying, of course, they're consuming gas. He's flying to conserve his fuel, but he's still burning gas at the same time, about 125 pounds a minute. Mongo told me on the phone, Sluggo, if that tanker wasn't there, like that KC-135 pilot said, my wingman and I would arrive over Herat low on gas, and we would have to eject, punch out. We would be the first prisoners of war the opening night of Operation Enduring Freedom. As he and his wingman are talking back and forth, they're talking about what their fuel state is, and it's not really good. 80 miles away from Herat, Mongo takes his radar and starts sweeping the air with his radar, trying to find this tanker. And at 80 miles, he gets a lock-on an airplane. Driving further, he sees through his night vision goggles that it in fact is a tanker. But when we're refueling the Navy, like I said, you have to have that drogue on the end of the boom. Is that drogue there? Because if it's a boom-only configured tanker, it's no use to them. They won't be able to refuel, and again, they're going to have to jump out of their jets. A few miles from the tanker, he sees through his NVGs that, in fact, there is a drogue on the boom, and they're way skosh on gas. He tells his wingman, plug in, get 1,000 pounds of comfort fuel, backs out. Mongo goes in, gets 1,000 pounds of comfort gas, and he lets his wingman get his mission gas first. Then Mongo gets his mission gas. And they made their timing. Mongo says he looks down, he goes, we're going to make it. And they head off to their target, drop their bombs, and make it out. They get a little bit more gas over Pakistan on the way out, and they're able to recover aboard the Enterprise and accomplish their mission. A few weeks later, after an analysis had been done of what the air threat was to tankers, they figured it was pretty minimal. And so they started putting tankers all over Afghanistan. And when I got there in January of 2002, we had tanker airspace in western, central, and eastern Afghanistan. There was plenty of gas, plenty of places to get gas. The only real problem was we'd be flying at 24,000 feet, and the mountains in Afghanistan would be only a couple thousand feet below us. They have 12,000 to 18,000 foot mountains in Afghanistan. And yes, there was Al-Qaeda guys that packed up to the top of some of these mountains with shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles, but no tankers were ever engaged. I hope you can see from this discussion, gas is always an issue in an air campaign. How much gas do we have in order to be able to accomplish this air campaign? And I think I've told you before, during Operation Iraqi Freedom, in 26 days, we transferred 417,133,000 pounds of gas out of tankers. A year later in Afghanistan, remember, starts on October 7th, and about the first week of October in 2002, we offloaded over 1 billion pounds of gas out of Air Force tankers. 1 billion pounds. That would allow every man, woman, and child in El Paso, Texas, 556,000 people, to own a car and drive for 6 months free on the Air Force. That's how much 1 billion pounds of gas is. The Air Force KC-135 community enjoys an incredible reputation. And this includes the KC-10 community, the big tanker in the Air Force inventory also. And we've had that reputation for a very long time, probably going back all the way to the Vietnam War. The legendary commander of the 8th Fighter Wing in the 1960s, Colonel Robin Old said, "A tanker guy never had to buy a drink at my bar because the tanker guys had saved so many of us. So many of us." And he also got to the tanker's flying boom for refueling once with like 800 pounds in his tanks too. During the air campaigns over Afghanistan and Iraq in 2001, 2002, 2003, that reputation for the tanker community was even more solidified as tankers once again went all over and made sure that everybody got the gas that they needed. All of the receivers that I've ever refueled trust the tankers. They know that they're going to be where they're supposed to be, at the altitude they're supposed to be at, airspeed they're supposed to be at, ready to refuel. All the time. It doesn't matter if it's an American fighter jet or an Australian tanker coming up to refill its tanks. People trust us. They trust that an American tanker will be exactly where it's supposed to be. And because of that trust, those F-16s in Desert Storm took off on their mission with the promise that tankers would be there, not even knowing where they were going to come from, and certainly not knowing what D. Wright had to go through to put that four-ship together at Jeddah to make it happen. We were just called by the black hole at Riyadh, which was running the air campaign, send 4 tankers out to refuel this package of Collie, Spaniel, and Pug and Falstaff to make sure they get their gas. But they trusted us. They took off on their mission not knowing where their backside gas was going to come from, only that tankers would be there waiting for them. And they trusted the black hole and they trusted the tanker community so much that they went ahead and did their mission. The young captain in Pug 6 that came up to my airplane had 800 pounds of fuel in his tanks that normally hold about 9,000 pounds. That gives you an idea of where he was in his fuel state. F-16 burns 125 pounds a minute. So he had just a little over 6 minutes of fuel left before his engine quit and he'd have to go over the side. See, in the air, you never say the word eject unless you are actually performing that, where you pull the handle, the rockets fire, and your seat goes out. The pilot said to us, "I'm going to have to go over the side because you never say eject." 6 minutes. 6 minutes. Can you imagine what he must have been thinking in his airplane when he finally sees, probably on radar, this 4-ship of tankers coming at him? Okay, here we go. They trusted us. And in combat, you trust your comrades to do their job. When Bongo and his inexperienced wingman got to the tanker over Herat, they only had 1,200 to 1,500 pounds in their tanks. So that's about 12 minutes of fuel left before they had engine fuel starvation. But they, again, a tanker pilot told them, there's a tanker over Herat with no receivers on it, ready to refuel. And Mongo turned north and went. When I was teaching at the Joint Forces Staff College, we'd have a number of people, 60-pound brain people from the government and from the different services come in and teach us. And I'll never forget this one gentleman, a brigadier general in the Army by the name of Wayne Michael Hall, who wrote a book called Warfare in the 21st Century. And what he told us was there's 4 elements of the decision maker's dilemma. A decision maker, or somebody that's thinking about what do I got to do, goes through these 4 elements: risk, time, quality of knowledge, and outcomes. And what he meant by that was, if you have valuable knowledge in a timely manner, you act with more certainty with a reduction of second and third order effects. If you have a great reputation and your customers trust you, they will assume a greater measure of risk. because they know how well you perform. How many times has somebody come to your desk and gave you more things to do because they've told you, we've seen your best work, we know what you can do? And even in these dire situations that we had planning and executing the air campaigns, the pilots took a greater measure of risk in their decision-making process because of our reputation, and they trusted us. 375 miles over the desert of death, Mongo goes on night vision goggles with this new lieutenant on his wing. He assumed a greater amount of risk because he trusted that tanker pilot when he said, there's another tanker up north, nobody on it, they'll give you gas, you can do what you need to do. In both of these instances, Collie, Spaniel, and Pug Flight, Mongo in his war party jets, were able to accomplish their missions and do some pretty Herculean things because they accepted this higher level of risk, knowing the tankers are always there, their reputation has preceded them, and I've got nothing to worry about. 6 to 12 minutes of gas is a lot to worry about. But still, every one of these people in Collie, Spaniel, and Pug flights, Mongo and his wingman got to sleep in their own beds because the tankers accomplished their mission like they always do. Thanks for being with us today, folks, and I hope that you've enjoyed these very hair-raising refueling experiences where there wasn't a lot of gas in these fighter jets, but they were able to make it back home. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Lessons from the Cockpit, where we've talked about reputation, trust, and risk. Special thanks to Tanker Pilot Lessons from the Cockpit for sponsoring this episode of Lessons from the Cockpit. There are 2 chapters in the book where these stories are written, and a matter of fact, there's actually pictures that I took out the window of Pug Flight refueling in the book. If you've enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends and family and let them know so that they can subscribe to the Lessons from the Cockpit show. If you would like 4 to 8 foot wall graphics of a War Party F-18 or one of the jets in Pug Flight, you can go to www.wallpilot.com, and in the ready to print area, you'll find Mongo's F-18 from VFA 87 and one of the Pug Flight airplanes that can either be framed or stuck to your wall because these things peel off and have a sticky backing, and you can put it on any smooth surface. I hope you'll look forward to our show next week. I don't know what I'm going to talk about next because I'm going back and forth on 2 different stories from my tanker career, and I'm also scheduling a couple of people to be interviewed on the show. As a matter of fact, Mongo is one of them. Thanks again, folks, for listening to the show today, and we'll talk to you next week.